I've seen the change from very sort of strict analog photography. I've been there, and then I've transitioned into using color large format, and then the change in 2000 to digital, where I started digitizing my negatives. So all that changed. So I would say I feel so lucky to be a photographer today in 2024. Hi, my name's Andrew Moore. I'm a fine art photographer, and I'm based in Kingston, New York. So when I was a young boy, my dad was a pretty serious amateur photographer, and at one point he and my brother and I, we built a small darkroom in the attic of our home. We learned how to develop film. We made black and white prints in our attic, and I photographed lots of landscapes and trees and rocks and telephone poles. And when I first showed my dad the results, he was like, well, I don't want to spend money on these crazy pictures you're making. So, you know, it's best that if you work in the darkroom and really learn how to make these rather than, you know, taking them to the photo store. So that was my start, but I really always liked color, so I wasn't sure about a career as a photographer when I was a teenager. You know, I was only making black and white pictures at the time, and in fact, in high school I did quite a bit of painting. But fortunately, I was very lucky to meet a wonderful master teacher when I was at Princeton named Emmett Gowan. And he was a tremendous inspiration on my life and a kind of father figure. So I studied with him for 3 years quite intensely. I learned how to use a large format camera. And also, very fortunately at that time, color photography was just coming of age. This would be in the mid-70s. Princeton actually put in a small color darkroom in 1977, so I was able to take advantage of that. I also met Joel Meyerowitz at the time, who was just producing his book, Cape Light. So I found his color work quite inspiring, although I did not particularly like him as a teacher, but at least I saw the possibilities of working in large format color. I graduated in 1979. I started working for some commercial photographers in New York City. I ended up moving to New Orleans in 1980, and I spent 2 years there and completed my first project, which were a series of interiors of old kind of industries like coffin factories and ice warehouses and Masonic lodges. In 1982, I returned to New York City and was living down on the South Street Seaport. I got together with a couple other photographers. We formed a collective called the South Street Survey, and I documented and photographed the end of the Fulton Fish Market because it was slowly being transferred to the Bronx at that point. So I worked for Elizabeth Murray and Robert Gober and a lot of artists at the Paula Cooper Gallery. I went to their studios and photographed their paintings and sculptures. That's how I made a living. And then I had my first solo show when I was 29. That would be in 1986. I presented a series of montages, which is where I was basically overlapping negatives, 8x10 negatives, and making these very wild prints of, I don't know, it's hard to explain, but very, very kind of dynamic, very complicated imagery. Anyway, that was my first show. 41 when I went to Havana for the first time, and that was truly a big turning point in my career because those pictures were the first pictures I felt that were significantly mine, like they were totally the way I thought and saw and completed, and that was a tremendously successful body of work that actually continues to sell until this day. The first photograph I remember making was of some rocks by the seaside. I don't know, and then also some telephone poles because I liked the graphic shapes. But the first picture I remember selling was actually when I was 14, and I had been to the Bronx Zoo and I took these pictures of some white tigers. The picture I made of Henry Ford's office, when at the time, his office when he was building the Model T Ford, So this is his office from around 1916 in Highland Park, Michigan. That picture, I think, is a kind of enduring picture about the deindustrialization of America. And it combines both a strong narrative and a very abstract quality. And was Picture of the Year in Time magazine, is owned by many institutions, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So that's probably my most famous picture. And then there's a picture I shot in the Great Plains called The Yellow Porch, which is probably one of my favorite pictures in terms of the color scheme of it, which it's all these shades of brown with a little bit of yellow and a little bit of white. And it's probably my favorite color photograph that I've ever made. There are some very personal pictures. My wife had a home birth. My older daughter, who was only 2 years older, so she came into the bedroom measuring the size of her foot against the baby. And they're so extraordinary, but they're very personal, and my wife's naked in the background. And so those are pictures that I probably will never publish, but they're amongst some of my favorite images. If you look at the body of my work, you can see I'm very interested in history and the past. You know, how the past has lingered on, how it influences the present. History was always my strongest subject in school, and I'm interested in that process of the way humans influence their environment, the way time influences our environment. And so that kind of historical evolutionary process change over time is really one of the basic themes of my work. I don't approach things with a concept. What I do is I'm more like a detective or an investigator. I go to a place, I have a feeling about it, I look around, I try to meet as many people as possible. I start by photographing kind of the low-hanging fruit, things, you know, old houses or, you know, crazy situations. And then I start peeling the layers back. And in that process of going deeper and peeling the layers is when the themes evolved in a way that connects to me in the most authentic way possible. I would say one of the things I thought about when I was kind of cutting my teeth as a photographer, or in my 20s, let's say, was I tried to do something every day for my art, for my craft. Whether it was make a picture, make a print, go see a movie, get a book I hadn't seen before, to have a conversation with somebody I hadn't met. You know, in some ways, be engaged with my art on it every day. And so it's a discipline, it's a practice. So I would say for young photographers, keep that in mind, that it's a discipline, that you need to do something every day for your art.